The North Vietnamese soldiers at the supply checkpoint called them the Ghosts, 6 men. No uniforms that matched any unit they could name, weapons that fired faster than anything they carried. A young NVA private grips his rifle tighter at the tree line, eyes scanning shadows that don't move the way shadows should. Behind him, a supply convoy idles in the dark, trucks loaded, men nervous, torches unlit. They've heard the stories passed down the line for months, teams that appear from nowhere, teams that vanish before artillery can answer, teams that, officially, do not exist. What he doesn't know is that 6 men are watching him right now, less than 40 meters away, counting trucks, marking coordinates, breathing slow. Staff Sergeant Walter Brennan lies flat in the brush on the Cambodian side of a border that, according to Washington, American soldiers have never crossed. Beside him, 2 fellow Americans, 4 Montagnard tribesmen, who know this jungle better than any map ever drawn. Together, they are a recon team of MACV-SOG, the most classified operation of the entire war. This is the story of the men the enemy feared enough to put a price on their heads. The men the United States Congress wouldn't officially acknowledge existed until decades after the war ended, and the men who fought beside them, who trusted America with their lives and were left behind when it mattered most. If you found this channel, we share something in common, a belief that these stories are too important to be forgotten. Every video here is built from declassified records and first-hand accounts. Subscribe and join a community that honors these men the right way. But what they didn't know that night was that the convoy below them wasn't the mission, it was the bait. Walter Brennan grew up in Beaumont, Texas, the son of a refinery mechanic and a schoolteacher, in a house close enough to the rail yards that he fell asleep most nights to the sound of freight cars coupling and uncoupling in the dark. He was the kind of kid who disappeared into the piney woods behind his house for entire weekends with nothing but a pocket knife and a canteen, and came back able to tell you exactly which way the creek had moved since the last rain. His father wanted him at the plant. Walter wanted the Army, and by 19 he had it, first as an infantryman, then after 2 tours that left him restless instead of finished, as a volunteer for Special Forces selection at Fort Bragg. By 1968, Staff Sergeant Brennan was 26 years old and had already spent more nights in contested jungle than most soldiers spend in combat in an entire career. He'd been assigned to Command and Control South, one of 3 regional commands under the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam Studies and Observations Group, MACV-SOG on paper, a name that meant nothing to anyone who hadn't been read into the program. SOG recon teams were small by design, 2 or 3 Americans, paired with 4 indigenous fighters, almost always Montagnard tribesmen from the Central Highlands, men whose families had lived in this terrain for generations and who knew its rhythms the way Brennan knew the sound of a train 2 miles off. The team's interpreter and second-in-command was a Montagnard sergeant the Americans called Yabham, not his full name, which none of them ever fully learned to pronounce, but the one he'd offered the first day he joined the team, and the one that stuck. Yabham had lost 2 brothers to NVA reprisals against Highland villages suspected of helping American forces. He didn't talk about it. He didn't need to. Everyone on the team understood exactly what he was risking every time he crossed the fence. The fence, that was what SOG operators called the border, Not a line on a map, but a fiction maintained by an entire government. Officially, American ground forces did not operate in Cambodia or Laos. The Geneva Accords, the official policy of neutrality, the carefully worded press briefings, all of it depended on American soldiers not being there, which meant that when Brennan's team crossed it, they crossed without dog tags that named their unit, without uniforms that could be traced to any American formation, carrying foreign weapons that wouldn't tie a body back to Washington if it came to that. If they were killed or captured, the United States government was prepared to say they had never existed. On the other side of that fence, the North Vietnamese Army was running a supply network that fed the entire Southern war effort. The network history would later call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, though by 1968 it was less a trail than a sprawling system of roads, depots, and bunkers stretching the length of Laos and into Cambodia, defended by tens of thousands of NVA troops, anti-aircraft batteries, and dedicated counter-reconnaissance units whose only job was hunting teams exactly like Brennan's. The NVA called these hunter units rat patrols in their own slang, and they had grown sophisticated. They tracked patterns. They learned insertion zones. They started leaving ambushes where SOG teams were statistically most likely to land. Brennan's mission this time was reconnaissance, not direct action. Locate and confirm a suspected NVA logistics route running east out of a base area just inside Cambodia, photograph what they could, and extract before daylight made the jungle a different kind of dangerous. 6 men. No artillery on call unless things went catastrophically wrong, and even then, only if someone back at Command and Control South was willing to risk revealing that American fire support was hitting targets inside a country the United States swore it would never touch. But what none of them could have known, lying in the brush that first night, was that they had already been spotted 3 hours before they ever saw the convoy. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a sound. It was the absence of one. Brennan had spent enough nights in this jungle to read it the way other men read weather. Cambodia's border forest had a rhythm, insects at dusk, the distant cough of a monkey, the constant low hum of a triple canopy ceiling alive with things that never stopped moving. An hour after they'd watched the supply convoy idle and pull away into the dark without incident, that rhythm went quiet, not gradually, all at once. Yabam felt it first. He raised 2 fingers without a word, the signal for something's changed. And the team froze in place, weapons up, breathing slowed to nothing. SOG operators trained for exactly this moment, more than almost any other skill, the ability to become invisible standing still in plain terrain. For nearly 20 minutes, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Brennan watched a column of ants cross the toe of his boot and didn't flinch. Then, faint and far off, came what they'd been trained their entire careers to fear most: the soft, metallic clink of NVA equipment moving in disciplined formation. Not a patrol stumbling through the brush, a unit that knew exactly where it was going. What Brennan didn't know, what no SOG team operating in this sector in 1968 could have known with certainty, was how thoroughly the North Vietnamese Army had adapted to them. By this point in the war, NVA counter-reconnaissance battalions had studied years of recovered American equipment, captured documents, and interrogated prisoners to build a working profile of how SOG teams operated. Their typical team size, their preferred extraction windows, even patterns in helicopter approach routes used by the Vietnamese-piloted gunships that supported these missions. Hanoi had also begun offering substantial bounties, in some sectors the equivalent of years of a soldier's pay, to any unit that captured or killed a member of what NVA radio traffic had started calling, almost with a kind of dark respect, the Phantom Soldiers. Brennan's team was now sitting almost directly on top of a transit point the NVA had specifically reinforced against exactly this kind of reconnaissance. The convoy hadn't been an isolated target of opportunity. It had been routed past a fixed security element whose sole job was watching the surrounding terrain for the small footprints, disturbed leaf litter, and faint radio signatures that gave SOG teams away. And they had found something an hour before Brennan's team ever spotted the trucks. Command and Control South had given Brennan's team a single emergency extraction window if the mission compromised. A clearing 4 kilometers northeast, usable only between 0400 and first light, when American helicopter activity along the border was least likely to draw international attention to a country the U.S. officially wasn't operating in. 4 kilometers through jungle this dense meant nearly 3 hours of movement if everything went right. They had less than that until the window opened, and the NVA element closing on their position wasn't moving toward the convoy's route at all. It was moving directly toward them. Most of what you've been told about this war stopped where the official record ended. This channel starts exactly where those records go silent. Subscribe and never miss the story behind the story. Brennan keyed his radio twice, the silent compromise signal, and got static in return. Whatever was about to happen, they were about to face it, with no confirmation that anyone on the other side of the fence even knew they were still alive. The first shot didn't come from where anyone expected. Brennan had positioned his team in a loose defensive line facing northeast toward the sound of NVA movement his instincts told him was the real threat. Instead, the jungle erupted from the southwest, a direction his team had marked as cleared less than 20 minutes earlier. A second NVA element, smaller and faster, had circled wide and come in from exactly the angle Brennan's training said was safe. That was the moment everything changed. Not the contact itself. SOG teams trained relentlessly for enemy contact. What changed was the realization, in the space of a single muzzle flash, that this hadn't been a chance encounter with a patrol. This was a coordinated trap, built around a team profile the enemy had clearly studied for months, designed to herd Brennan's 6 men away from their emergency extraction point and into a kill zone the NVA had likely rehearsed. Specialist Tom Reyes, Brennan's junior radio operator, took a round through the meat of his left shoulder in the opening seconds and went down hard against a fallen log, biting back a sound that could have given away the team's exact position. Yabam was already moving, dragging Reyes by the strap of his pack toward what little cover the terrain offered, returning fire over his shoulder with the same economical precision he used, clearing brush from a trail. Brennan made the call that would define the rest of the night in under 3 seconds. The way men trained for this kind of war learned to, they would not run for the original extraction point. The route there now sat directly between 2 converging NVA elements. Instead, they would break south, Toward broken terrain neither force seemed to be covering, an attempt to raise command and control south on the move, using a backup frequency reserved for exactly this kind of catastrophic compromise. It was a decision made with partial information, under fire, by a 26-year-old staff sergeant who understood that whichever direction he chose, men under his command were likely to bleed for it. What happened over the next 11 minutes would later be reconstructed in fragments from after-action reports that were themselves classified for decades, incomplete, contradictory in places, written by men who survived to file them, and silent about the ones who didn't make it back to tell their own version. The jungle on the southern break was worse than any of them had trained for. Not triple canopy, but something closer to a wall, vines and thorn brush thick enough that movement meant tearing through it by hand, weapon slung, blade out. Every second spent cutting a path being a second, the NVA elements behind them used to close the gap. Brennan took point through the worst of it, machete in one hand, M16 in the other, cutting blind because stopping to look meant losing the half-step of distance. That was the only thing keeping his team alive. Behind him, Yabam and a second Montagnard fighter, a wiry, soft-spoken man the team had nicknamed Doc for his uncanny knack for field medicine, carried Reyes between them, his wounded shoulder packed with gauze that was already soaked through, his face the color of old paper. The NVA element from the southwest had picked up their trail within minutes. Brennan could hear them now, not at a sprint, but at a disciplined jog, the pace of men who knew the terrain favored patience over speed. Twice, the team stopped just long enough for Brennan and the remaining American operator, a young sergeant named Mike Castellano on his first SOG rotation, to lay down covering bursts into the brush behind them, not aimed at anything they could see, just enough sustained fire to make pursuit costly and buy 90 more seconds of distance. It was during the second of these stops that Doc went down. He never made a sound. One moment he was shifting his grip on Reyes's good arm to take more of the wounded man's weight. The next he simply folded, a single round having found him through a gap in the brush that nobody on the team ever identified. Yabam caught him before he hit the ground, and for 3 full seconds, an eternity in a firefight, simply held him, checking for a pulse that wasn't there, before continuing to move, because stopping any longer meant the rest of the team died too. There was no time to carry him. There was no time to do anything but mark the spot in memory and keep moving. And every man on that team would carry the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. Not because it was wrong, but because it was the only choice that existed. And there is a particular kind of grief reserved for men who know with total certainty that they did the only thing they could have done and still cannot forgive themselves for it. Brennan radioed the backup frequency 3 times over the next 20 minutes with no response, the static answering him with the particular silence of a man who has started to consider, seriously and clearly, that no one is coming. SOG teams operated with the understanding, spoken to no one, carried by everyone, that compromised missions in denied territory sometimes simply disappeared. No extraction, no confirmation. A name read once at a memorial service years later, attached to a cause of death that said nothing true about where or why. It was Castellano, on the 4th attempt, who got a single broken transmission through. 11 seconds of garbled static that contained, buried in the noise, 3 words: read you, hold. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't even a promise. It was confirmation that somewhere, on the other side of a fence that officially didn't exist, someone now knew 6 men, 5 now, were still fighting to get back across it. What happened in the next 4 minutes would determine whether that mattered at all. The team reached a shallow ravine that offered the first real cover they'd had in over an hour, and Brennan made the second impossible call of the night. Hold here, dig in, and trade space for time, because moving further with a wounded man and an enemy force that had now fully committed to pursuit meant running until someone made a fatal mistake from exhaustion alone. What changed the fight wasn't a weapon. It was a radio call that, by every official rule governing this war, shouldn't have been answered the way it was. 11 minutes after Castellanos' broken transmission reached Command and Control South, a flight of 2 helicopter gunships, flown on paper by South Vietnamese air crews, but in practice often crewed in part by American pilots, operating under the same denied presence rules that governed Brennan's team, lifted off from a forward staging area and crossed the same fence Brennan's men had crossed 2 nights earlier. Officially, this flight never happened. There would be no after-action report filed under any name that connected it to American forces, no entry in any public record acknowledging that U.S.-flown aircraft had engaged targets inside Cambodia that night. What the NVA element pursuing Brennan's team experienced from the ground was considerably less abstract. Rotor noise growing fast out of the dark, then rocket and minigun fire ripping into the tree line they'd been using for cover, fired with a precision that meant whoever was flying had been given near-exact coordinates only minutes earlier. The gunships couldn't land. The terrain offered nothing flat enough, and the tactical situation was still too hot to risk a hover. What they could do was buy time, making repeated low passes over the pursuing NVA element, while a slower, unarmed extraction helicopter held at a safer distance, waiting for any opening. It came twice and was waved off twice, the team's position still too tightly enclosed by jungle canopy for a safe approach. On the ground, the effect was immediate and decisive. The disciplined, patient pursuit that had been closing on Brennan's team for the better part of 2 hours broke apart under sustained aerial fire it had no answer for. NVA counter-reconnaissance units operating this deep into Cambodia carried no significant anti-aircraft capability of their own. That kind of firepower was reserved for protecting the trail networks further north, not chasing down a single 6-man team. For the first time since the ambush began, the pressure on Brennan's position eased enough for his team to move. It was Yabam who found the gap, a thin seam in the canopy roughly 200 meters from the ravine, just wide enough for a careful approach that he'd noted on the way in 3 days earlier without ever expecting to need it. He guided the extraction bird and himself, standing fully exposed in a clearing barely large enough for the skids to touch ground, directing the pilot by hand signal because the radio traffic was too saturated with the gunship's own coordination to risk adding another voice. They lifted off with 5 men instead of 6. Reyes survived the flight back across the fence, unconscious for most of it from blood loss, but alive when the helicopter touched down at the forward staging base just after 0500. Field surgeons would later credit Doc's emergency treatment, applied in the minutes before he was killed, with keeping Reyes alive long enough to make it out. It was a detail that would mean everything and nothing to the men who carried it. Their friend had saved a life with the last clear-headed minutes of his own. Doc's body was never recovered. SOG policy in 1968 made clear, in language none of the men needed, explained to them, that recovery operations for the dead in denied territory were authorized only when the tactical risk to the living was acceptable, and in the chaos of that extraction. With a second NVA element still unaccounted for and the gunships running low on fuel, it was judged not to be. He was listed, in records that would remain classified for decades, simply as missing, his family back in the Central Highlands, never given anything more definite than that. Never given a body to bury, never given the closure that comes with knowing exactly where someone is laid to rest. Brennan returned to Command and Control South with 2 fewer fingers worth of grip in his left hand, from a wound he hadn't fully registered until the adrenaline wore off, and a silence in him that the rest of the team learned, in the days that followed, not to interrupt. There was no debrief that acknowledged what had actually happened in any official sense. No public citation, no unit recognition, nothing that could exist on paper without exposing an operation. The United States government was still, as a matter of policy, denying. What existed instead was a private accounting, team to team, the only kind these men were permitted. A name added to a list kept unofficially by SOG veterans themselves, men who understood that if they didn't remember their own dead, no institution was going to do it for them. Yabam carried that weight differently than the Americans on the team. He had grown up understanding that his people's service to the United States carried a cost that extended beyond any single mission, a cost his own family had already paid twice before this operation ever began. The supply route they'd been sent to confirm was real, exactly where intelligence had suspected, and the information made its way back through channels that decades later historians would still be working to fully reconstruct from documents the U.S. Congress did not officially acknowledge as part of any sanctioned military operation until long after the war's end. Across the entire span of the war, more than 2,700 SOG reconnaissance missions crossed into Laos and Cambodia under operations like Daniel Boone and Prairie Fire, missions the United States government would not formally acknowledge existed until decades after the last American troops came home. The casualty rate among SOG operators remains, by some estimates, among the highest of any American unit to serve in Vietnam, with some calculations suggesting that nearly every operator who served a full rotation was killed or wounded at some point in his service. These were small teams asked to do extraordinarily dangerous work in places their own government would not admit they had ever been sent. And then there is the part of this story that gets told far less often. What happened to the men like Yabam after the war ended? The Montagnard fighters who served alongside American Special Forces for nearly a decade, who bled for missions most of their own countrymen never knew took place, were largely left behind when American forces withdrew. Many faced direct retaliation from the post-war Vietnamese government, specifically because of that service. Imprisonment, forced relocation, and in some document cases, far worse. A people who had trusted the United States with their lives and the safety of their families were, in the final accounting, treated as a footnote to a war their service had helped fight. Walter Brennan would go on to finish his tour and return to a country that had no framework for understanding what he had done, because officially he had done nothing at all. The story is true, as much of it as has ever been allowed to surface. The cost was real. And nearly 60 years later, the country these men fought for is still working out what exactly it owes the ones who carried that fight in silence, and the ones who never made it home to ask.